Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Iran's approach towards human rights is a comprehensive one. In addition to civil and political rights, great importance has been attached to economic, social and cultural rights, where sustainable success and tangible accomplishments have been achieved. Unfortunately, these progress have not received due regards by the Special Rapporteur and concerned states. Progress of human rights was prepared in a volume, and distinguished delegates and NGOs can get a copy of it at the entrance of this room. Iran is a country that has always respected its human rights obligations at the national and international levels. To assess and having a judgment on domestic policies and conducts, one shall have a specialized knowledge of the cultural background and laws and regulations of the states. We are ready to explain our system and laws for those who are in need to avoid prejudgment. It goes without saying that we have human rights dialogue also for cooperation with more than 10 countries, such as Switzerland, Italy, Japan and Indonesia, through which specialized issues are discussed, views and experiences are exchanged, and reciprocal visits are done of courts and prisons. This is also a good mechanism for having this dialogue and interaction with the other countries in the international community. I emphasize that Iranian society is rich in civilization and culture, where respecting human rights is inherently institutionalized. While Iran is fully committed to its human rights obligations, is ready to share its experiences and learn lessons with other interested countries. With this explanation, I welcome the statements made by distinguished delegates who have stressed on professionalism, non-political and impartial work in the field of human rights with the sense of cooperation. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
I thank distinguished representative of Islamic Republic of Iran for the statement. And now I give the floor to Mr. Ahmed Shahid for his concluding remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Let me begin by thanking all delegations and NGOs who spoke in the interactive dialogue this afternoon. I might not have the time to respond to all questions that have been posed to me, but let me try to group them together in some fashion and see if I can compositely address the issues that have been raised. But before I do that, may I preface my remarks with 3 observations I think applies broadly to what I'm going to say. Firstly, it is that Iran is not a monolith. In addition to the diversity we have spoken about ethnically and religious-wise, we also speak about conservatives, moderates, reformists. So there's a wide range of opinion in the country which needs to be borne in mind. The other is the contradictions, therefore, this produces in Iran. Even if one looks at the Constitution, you find a commitment to democracy coupled by a commitment to other principles which undermine those principles. So there's a lot of contradictions in the way the system is set up, and we can observe the impact of that in various trends we see in the country politically as well. Then finally, the third point I want to note is that we have the experience of the previous Human Rights Commission and the mandate that was there at that time. Iran has had a mandate for over 20 years, and the way the Council, the Commission had engaged with the mandate, I think is instructive in terms of the queries many have raised about the efficacy of the country mandate and the need or otherwise to continue with the mandate. Let me begin by speaking about what I think is the critical role a country mandate plays in this case, in the case of Iran. I think the mandate has been able to shed light on a number of key areas of concern, mobilizing increased cooperation and engagement on the part of the government itself to address its concerns, and also, I believe, empowering human rights defenders and civil society, many of whom we've heard in this assembly as well. And also empowering human rights defenders, civil society actors, and reformists and stakeholders to push what they profess to be their respect for human rights, and also increase accountability for rights violations on the ground. So the increased transparency that the mandate brings, I think, is very useful. It also enables Iranian officials to address issues that may otherwise not be addressed. The road, nevertheless, is long, and there are many challenges. And I believe the mandate had made gains in a number of these areas. when the mandate was set up in 2011, Iran's cooperation and engagement with UN bodies was at an all-time low. There was a backlog of over 549 communications over a 5-year period preceding the mandate's establishment. And there had been a number of rapporteurs who were refused entry to the country for a long period by the time the mandate was set up. Yet, since the publication of the reports to the Council here, one notices a growing sense of cooperation with the mandate itself under Item 4 and also in other parts of the UN human rights mechanism. The UPR process was done smoothly, although the follow-up, the implementation of this is one that one needs to keep a close watch on. Iran's participation in treaty body reviews has happened over the past 5-year period. Over three bodies have reviewed Iran, and a fourth one will do so next year. And Iran, just as we heard, has an extended invitation to 2 rapporteurs to visit the country, and we hope that it will also include the 7 rapporteurs who have been knocking on Iran's door for a number of years now, with key concerns with regard to what's happening on the country. And I'm also happy to report that Iran's response rate to the communication from the OHCHR has increased to a very healthy 40%, has maintained this rate even at the current year as well. And engagement with me itself has evolved over time, enabling me to get better information on what's happening in the country, and also enabling many Iranians to contact with me, engage with me here in Geneva. So I think these are all positive trends that have been enabled by having a country mandate. But having said that, I should add that there are a number of fundamental, substantive, and procedural human rights concerns ranging from laws that clearly and explicitly violate international human rights standards and obligations on the part of Iran, and those that are not implemented even if the laws met these international obligations that Iran has. And there are a number of key indicators of this, and I will highlight a few of these. As I said in my opening presentation, the per capita execution rate of Iran dwarfs that by any other member state in the UN, and that has been the case consistently for a number of years now. Iran executes the largest number of juvenile offenders anywhere in the world, and that's a practice only a few countries still retain in their legal systems. And for a number of years now, Iran has been consistently one of the largest prisons for journalists, which again is a very serious concern when one speaks about the space there is for people themselves to highlight issues and address concerns about rights violations. Of course, the contradictions I referred to between the democratic commitments in the Constitution and other parts of the Constitution which sort of push them back is also evident in what we observe in Iran. For example, the election of President Rouhani, a moderate president, was followed by a staggering surge in the number of executions and arrests of journalists and social media activists and artists in the country. So you see a moderate agenda from a president accompanied by a surge in serious rights violations in the country. And of course I welcomed the election a few weeks, two and a half weeks back, where a number of moderate candidates won seats in the parliament. But this was preceded by the highest percentage of disqualifications Iran has ever seen in the past 30 years of elections, and almost twice the number was disqualified in the previous elections. So you can see, on the one hand, while we welcome the election of a number of reformists and a smooth election, we also have to notice the fact that there have been a large number of others who have been disqualified. And historically, when you look at the correlation between election disqualifications and events in the country, one notes that Iran is now poised for possible changes if the right motivations can be added to this. And one also notes the high literacy and women's participation in society, how that compares with women's role in the economy. Iran has one of the lowest rates of women's participation in the labor force, especially in comparison to high attainment its women and girls have in the education sector. Likewise, the resilience of Iran's civil society is to be applauded, despite the crackdown it had gone through in the period from 2005 to 2013. And of course, I do note that there is a growing space for certain NGOs, those who operate in the charitable sectors, the humanitarian sectors, and the social sector, to operate more than before. So I believe that these contradictions and peculiarities in Iran tells me that there is space with external support for the people of Iran to make advances in addressing the issues that have been raised. But because there have been some openings, and because there has been more engagement, and because there's some progress, I think we should be mindful not to repeat the errors made in 2002, when the Commission decided that, given President Khatami's call for change, that the Council should wind down the mandate. As an example, today we speak about the need to raise the age of criminal responsibility to 18 years of age. In 2003, Iran did actually pass a law raising the age bar to 18 years. But it didn't become a law because it didn't pass the thresholds required for it to become effective. So I think if we take our eyes off the ball, as it were, it may be that even the positive moves now in train may not clear the final hurdles for them to become law and then practice as well. In regard to the human rights defenders situation, which some delegations posed to me, I would like to state that the situation is not very positive, partly because, as I note in my report, there are a number of lawyers in detention, and some of the most prominent lawyers in the country are facing some sort of legal sanction, partly because they were engaged in advocacy for rights of other individuals who are defending, or more broadly, for human rights. And there is continuing pressure on the by association, where there are moves in train which would increase the pressure on them or the influence of the government on the way they function. And I have also noted the high number of journalists and social media activists who are in detention, which again augurs ill for the space for human rights defenders. And finally, I also want to refer in this context to the a bill called Political Crimes Bill, which would essentially criminalize efforts to reform government's policies or criticism of government officials. So there is, while there is some space for civil society engagement, the space for actual human rights defenders is not very positive. Now, going through some of the queries raised by some delegations. How would access assist the work of my mandate? I think more than assisting my work, it would assist Iranian reformers in government and elsewhere to advance their agenda, because it is often difficult to create a domestic discourse on human rights without some sort of external support for that. So the debates in the Council here mirror back in the country in form of a discourse which will enable things to move forward. One example is the present moves to change the drug laws. The first promise of that was made following a council debate here 2 years ago, and I hope that sustained concern over this practice, which, as we saw from the Vice President 2 weeks ago, had resulted, at least in one village, the execution of all males for drug offences. If we maintain this discussion in this council, then there is the I think incentive in Iran to address these concerns in a way that would address their issues as well as the concerns raised in the Council here. So I think more than benefiting my work, it would benefit Iranian NGOs who are working in a number of sectors, and Iranian government officials who want to engage on reforms and advance their commitments to reform. In terms of the long-term trends of women's rights and minority rights and juvenile executions, I've said in my report and presentation that the trend for juvenile executions is quite concerning in the past 10-year trend. In the past 2 years, it's been quite a surge in that. And I'm concerned that recent changes to laws have not actually addressed this particular concern. For minorities, again, the trends have continued. And as I note, for the Baha'i, there's been, at least judging by the response my report got from the government of Iran, that I'm concerned that the rhetoric has intensified, and that there's no change in terms of how they're addressing their rights. On women's rights, we've heard about the increasing activity of women in the civil society sector. But again, I am concerned that while education levels are remarkable and should be applauded for their attainment, these don't translate to actual economic, if you like, output or employment in the economy. So that's something Iran, I think, has to address in terms of addressing that trend. And I also want to point out that there is a bill in the pipeline which could further undermine women's access to the marketplace. A bill that is in the pipeline would require employers to give top priority to hiring men who are married and have children, and then to married men, then followed by married women, and of course there is no mention of single women in this case. So this sort of legislation could really discriminate against women's entry into the workforce. I've spoken about human rights defenders. Now, in terms of obstacles in the post-election scenario, I would think that given the high rate of reformist MPs in the parliament that will convene in 2 months' time, I would think that engagement at item 4 in the council would be something that would motivate them to push ahead with their reforms. The pitching of democratic principles in the constitution with certain other principles need not necessarily be an impediment, because there are certain flexible ways of reading these restrictions which could provide for a more human rights friendly outcome. I note, for example, Iran's current moratorium on stoning, which again speaks to these sort of limitations that are placed there on account of cultural arguments. Would the internal discussions on death penalty succeed? I would think, if you look at the way it has evolved for the past 2 years, it's still very cautious discussion. It was initially presented in the wings of a debate in the council. Now it has been endorsed by 70 MPs, and then I hope that it will become part of government's legislation as it moves forward in the new parliament. But I think continued international engagement would be necessary for Iran to be encouraged to move forward in this direction. What can be done? What more can be done to ensure that there is more favorable situation for ethnic and religious minorities in the country and for freedom of expression? I think Iran should be encouraged to follow up on its review of the Human Rights Committee 3 years ago, where a number of recommendations were made by the committee, and Iran hasn't followed up on these, nor have they replied to the issues raised by the committee. So I hope Iran can be encouraged to respond to these recommendations of the committee, and it falls fundamentally on respecting Iran's constitution and its obligations. Now, there are provisions in the constitution which will guarantee that there is no persecution on account of religion, but because they are either ignored or other provisions are observed, in practice what amounts to is persecution of minority faiths. And finally, in regard to the space for freedom of expression, Iran argues that its limitations on religious freedom and on expression are consistent with Articles 18 and 19 of the ICCPR, a very broad and vague reading of limitations that are permissible. I think more engagement with Iran on this subject would be fruitful, as well as ensuring that to give a degree of confidence about the space in the country for its indigenous attempts to thrive. There must be space for journalists to report freely on what they find. There must be space for people to criticize when governments violate laws. There must be space for human rights defenders to document and report on issues that they find are issue of concern for them. Of course, there are draconian laws at the moment which could impose severe penalties for certain form of speech, including death penalty for certain form of speech. I think these have to be addressed. So more attempts need to be made by the Islamic Republic of Iran and the Council to ensure that Iran actually observes commitments voluntarily made both in the UPR and the treaty bodies in order for it to move forward. I want to conclude by saying it's been my duty to serve in this mandate for the past 5 years, and I would like to thank the government of Iran for its recent commitment to engaging with me in providing me information, in giving me access to officials coming out of Tehran who are actually involved in a number of actions that have a bearing on what we speak about today, and also to thank the Iranian NGO community who travel out to Geneva to meet me. I do believe that the work that they do now in the humanitarian sector, in social sector, can be important drivers. They can be important drivers in operationalizing or mainstreaming human rights in Iran as we move from political and economic and social economic rights to having them effected on the ground. So the main message I have is that two things. A, we have to encourage Iran to ensure that their laws comply with international obligations that they have undertaken. And secondly, that the very positive changes recently made including, for example, the creation of the youth courts for youths. These measures, we have to ensure that Iran is supported and Iran does move forward in actually implementing them. So the gap between law and practice, between commitment and law, these two gaps need to be addressed, and I hope that in time to come, the new parliament will encourage that process, and the council here would be motivated to support that process. Thank you very much.